Hello there, I'm Tanya Khazanov, and you are listening to Human and Holy. We are back for another Wednesday solo session, and I'm so excited. If you missed the announcement sounds so official. I don't know, just kind of like a soft launch. But the first episode came out the Wednesday before Pesach, and we are now doing 2 episodes per week. Sunday episodes will be interviews. Wednesday episodes will be solo sessions with me, where I'll be exploring either sources that are kind of mentioned in our interviews, going deeper on some of the topics that we explore in our conversations, talking about upcoming Jewish holidays, answering questions that come in through our inbox, and just having this opportunity to connect one-on-one with you and for us to go deeper together into all things human and holy. Today I'm doing a quasi book review on this book, Reclaiming Dignity, A Guide to Tznius for Both Men and Women by Bracha Polikoff and Anthony Manning. We had Bracha on the podcast this past Sunday, so I highly recommend checking out that conversation. And I was so taken by this book, read it multiple times, which I don't do often. I want to share some of my own personal reflections on the themes in this book, some of the ideas that were explored there that I think are really important and meaningful and can really shift the way that we interact with tznius. This is not an exhaustive review of this book. I'm not going to be covering every single topic that was covered in the book. I'm just going to be sharing some of the highlights or themes or ideas that were explored that really touched me, that I thought were really meaningful. And in addition to that, I'm not going to be sourcing every single person who said each piece that I'm mentioning, but this episode, this conversation is all sourced in this book. I'll link it in the show notes. And if you are interested in learning more or exploring some of the sources that I mentioned or some of the essays that are spoken about, then I highly recommend checking out this book and going deeper into this topic. I want to start just by reflecting on something that Rabbi Manning noted in the book that I thought was very astute, which is that tznius does not have a good definition in English. There are many words that are given as a definition for tznius: modesty, dignity, self-respect, privacy, but none of them can fully capture what tznius or tzniut. Tznius is my pronunciation. Tzniut might be yours, but I'm just going to go with mine because it feels the most natural to me. The actual meaning and depth of the concept of tznius cannot be captured in a single English word, and especially because the concepts of tznius are so much richer than just the word itself. And that's often something that happens with the Hebrew word, is that the Hebrew word holds so much more than its translation because it connotes all of the deeper teachings about the word tznius that a word like modesty cannot hold, because tznius is not just modesty, and tznius is not just dignity, and tznius is not just privacy. It is all of those and more. Another thing I want to speak about, just for the technicalities of language, is the divisions of tznius that Bracha highlights in her introduction that I think is very helpful, which is the 4 main connotations that the word tznius has. One is tznius as a Torah mitzvah, a principle of retaining our dignity. Second is tznius as a halachic obligation. Third is tznius as a cultural practice. And 4 is tznius as a midah, a character trait that we cultivate and develop throughout our lives. But it's really important to recognize that in our cultural conversation around tznius, and this is something that this book really highlighted for me, we are exploring the tip of the iceberg when there is so much depth hiding beneath the surface. And even though the halachic expression, for example, in dress, is a part of tznius, it is the tip of the iceberg of the depth that is available to us in this profound Torah value, halachic obligation, and midah and way of being in the world. And we do such a disservice to the beauty and richness and the sensitivity that we could cultivate within ourselves around the principles of tznius when we only hinge it on the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to be using these themes and connotations interchangeably, and hopefully by the end of this episode, hopefully we'll have a fuller picture of what tznius can be, far beyond the tip of the iceberg that we often experience it as in our own lives. And especially if you are a woman who is provoked by this topic, I invite you to stay with me. I am on your team. I know what it's like. I am a regular woman who struggles with this topic just as you do, and some of the communal norms around this topic. And I have a deep internal appreciation for the principles of tznius, but some of the expressions of it have been tricky or challenging for me to navigate, which is why I found this book to be so incredibly refreshing. I couldn't believe that a book on tznius that is so true to the halachic sources could also be so safe and awakening and respectful and non-judgmental. And I hope that that tone will carry into the way that I speak about the book. Any mistakes that I make are mine and not the author's. This is a flawless piece of work. I don't know if you can see, but I have 500 bookmarks. At a certain point, it was getting ridiculous. It was okay, I can't bookmark every single page. Maybe I should just commit this to memory. Maybe I should get an IV drip to make sure that I retain every single moment of this book. I loved it that much. So one of the ideas that came up in this book that was very thoughtful to me was the idea of tznius being about the sanctity of a person's inner world. So much of tznius is about dignity and internality and an internal self-respect. The Maharal defines being a tzniua, being a tznius person, as being someone who is internally focused, a pnimi. And all of us have an internal world. And how we relate to that internal world, I think, is the foundation of how we will address this midah, this principle of tznius. Because cultivating an inner world that is self-contained, that recognizes that it belongs to itself, that it does not need to be shared with anyone or anything, not even people closest to it, in order for it to be of extreme value and presence with God, is the foundation of what tznius is. We live in a very external world where the inner world that can't be seen and can't be expressed is not necessarily valued in the way that things that we can see and can appreciate. But within our own selves, to cultivate a deep sense of appreciation and respect for the sacredness of our own inner worlds, the privacy of our own inner worlds, and how we can be with Hashem in a contained space inside of our hearts and minds. It's not for anybody else. It does not need to be shared in order to be a holy and sacred space for us to live within. And I think that the stronger our inner worlds are, the more we can trust ourselves in the way that we show up in the world, the stronger we cultivate an inner center that we trust belongs only to us, the more we are able to show up to the world in a very internal way, with an external expression that honors our own internality and doesn't mine our inner worlds for expression in the outer world. Tznius is about knowing what's yours. To me, there's such relief in this. What's mine? What do I never want to share with the world? What belongs solely in this heart and mind? How can I truly honor the sanctity of my own inner world? And one of the core principles in the book is that primarily what tznius is about being lifnei Hashem, being before God in our most internal spaces, not just in the way that we act in private, but in our own internal worlds. And one of the quotes that I loved from Rabbi Manning was, tznius is described as a deep inner yearning for a private connection to God, who is described as kel mistater, a hidden private God. And he notes how Rashi says, when Hashem told Moshe to come up to the mountain alone to receive the second set of luchos, we are being taught that there is no more beautiful quality than tznius. The first luchos were given with a lot of fanfare and they were broken. And the second set of luchos, which were given privately and quietly, were eternal. The things in our lives that are sourced in that internal space where we are truly walking with Hashem and are then shared externally have a completely different sense of rootedness and higher power and sanctity and boundaries and dignity that we cannot have when there's just this translucent connection between our inner world and our external expression. And I'm sharing this as someone who is so easily expressive, as someone who literally has a direct pipeline from her heart to her mouth. I have learned over time what it means to honor my own pauses, what it means to honor that little voice that says, not yet, what it means to express in a way that maintains the sanctity and the privacy of my own inner world, what it means to share personally and generously and 100% honestly without oversharing or sharing things that I don't feel comfortable with. And this is obviously not something that I do perfectly at all, but the reframing for me of this being lifnei Hashem, before God, and allowing that to create the parameters and the sanctity of my own inner space is such a clarifying piece for me around how to honor our own sensitivities and the subtleties of when and how we share and how much and in what way and in what forum and in what format and to who and in what space and all of those details that sometimes I think the explicit direction that's given to people actually shuts down our own intuition. We feel the pause, we feel that sense. We don't need anyone to tell us exactly how to do it. When we get quiet and we get more connected to ourselves, it becomes a lot easier to reflect what it means to truly walk with Hashem internally and how that can shift the way that we show up into the world. And I think that we're living in a time, just like in a secular world, where I think that pnimius is actually really valued, like personal authenticity and showing the nuts and bolts of things. And I was reading something that was speaking about how even really, really large successful brands are having to pivot in this age of social media in sharing the behind the scenes process and sharing a day in the life of the founders or things like that, which people were bemoaning that it's a performative authenticity where we are seeing a stripped back version, an authentic version of what happens behind the scenes because that is what sells right now, but it's not actually authenticity. It's performative authenticity, which I think we see a lot of on the internet space, where you're seeing all these private, internal, genuine, authentic moments that are either contrived or someone set up a camera for it. And we smell that like something is a little bit off and it's not like really just truly a pure expression. But on the other hand, and this is the beautiful side of it, is I think that as we move towards a time of Mashiach, when the internal is going to be valued more than the external, when we do connect more to the inner world of another person, to the inner experience, to the authentic expression of a person's inner world, and we can smell when those two things don't necessarily match so well, we are experiencing a resurgence of that even just in current culture, where the consumer appreciates authenticity, even if it is at times performative authenticity. But I think it's a shift towards an appreciation of the internal world and the external being a match and a synthesis with the internal world. This is such a huge mindset shift to me with Tznius, because I think one of my greatest struggles with Tznius is the way that it has become so externally focused, how it's become a spiritual marker for people, how it has become the central focus of a woman's Judaism, and how we have lost the connection to that internal sensitivity. And I certainly have in many ways. And so I'm not like pointing fingers at anyone else, but just reflecting internally how when there is an overemphasis, which I definitely have an overemphasis on the details of Tznius, then sometimes it can get very divorced and disconnected from the essence of Tznius, which those details should just be a natural reflection of. And we'll speak a little bit more about the halachic piece here. But for starters, Tznius is an area where there are deeper philosophical points that are explored and sensitivities for each of us to cultivate, which express themselves in details that are going to be a lot more subjective than other halachos. And one example that the rabbi brings in this book is the Mishnah Brura that speaks about how a person shouldn't walk around their house barefoot. And he says when he learned that, he turned to his rabbi and was like, I can't walk around my bedroom barefoot. And the rabbi said, listen, it's a madrega, it's a level. And he was like, that seems odd, right? We don't say turning the light on Shabbos is a madrega, it's a level. Obviously, if someone is, using electricity on Shabbos and they're growing in their Judaism, we obviously all grow in our halachic practice, and it's not an all or nothing game, and none of us are doing all of it. So that's obvious. But we still have like the objective, like either this is halachic or this is non-halachic. We have that very clear understanding. When it comes to tznius, there seems to be a lot more gray areas and a lot more sensitivities and a lot more subjective pieces of tznius. If someone heard that their Rosh Yeshiva or their teacher was walking barefoot in their bedroom, they probably wouldn't be shocked or taken aback, because it's completely the norm. It's completely dignified for someone to walk within their own bedroom barefoot. They don't have to put their socks on under their blanket. But if someone was living in a time where that wasn't considered dignified, and if someone did hear that someone in a position of leadership or spiritual leadership walked out of their bed and didn't put on socks before, and that was considered something extremely undignified or disrespectful, then in that position and in that place and in that time, that would be considered modest. That would be considered tznius. So you see this like subjective experience of some of the deeper sensitivities and details of tznius. One of the misconceptions about tznius is that the main focus is in the public domain on how you leave your house. But in reality, the main focus of tznius is actually how you are internally with God, and also how you act in the bathroom and how you act within your own home. Another misconception about tznius is that it's mainly about clothing and tangentially about everything else. But in reality, tznius shows up in a huge way in the way that we speak, in our financial priorities, in the way that we show up to social media, in the way that we express ourselves to the world, in the way that we speak to a friend. And a piece that was spoken about in this book, which I thought was so interesting, and I'd never thought about it this way, was overspending on how you look, and how overspending or being obsessed with your appearances can send the message to others that I value my external world more than my internal world, because I pour more energy and more time and more money into my external world than into my internal world. And that can be a distraction from the inner world and from the soul and the essence of a person. Really investing our time, money, energy into something more internal is about moving our self-identification away from how others see us towards how God sees us, and towards how we behave when nobody is watching, and towards what happens inside of our own minds and hearts. And that self-identity being cultivated from something inside of us. And part of tznius is being able to engage in a spiritual act in private and not having to share that with anyone else. Obviously, we always speak about like the highest measurement of tznius being someone who is able to give charity in a private and anonymous manner, even though I think there's also enormous value to doing it publicly to inspire others to give. But I think the general principle is that if I do a good thing and no one but God knows about it, did I still do a good thing? Do I see enormous value in a holy, sacred act that happens only inside of an internal sphere that I cannot identify with externally, but I can identify with internally? I know who I am. I know how I choose to show up in the world. And that's where I receive my identity and my value and my worth from, is from walking with God and not through being identified externally in a certain way. And it's so ironic to be talking about this because as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about how sometimes our experience of tznius, when it does become so external and becomes reduced only to the way that we dress, even though our dress may be a piece of our tznius, but when we only make it about that, we actually confuse ourselves and we can smell something rotten because the tznius becomes so externalized and becomes about identifying in a certain way. And instead of being this natural expression and outgrowth of walking before Hashem and being connected to Allah in a deep and internal character-driven way, it becomes something that is externally focused, which is literally the opposite of tznius, which is about receiving our identity from within, from our internal worlds, from an internal space, and not through other people's perception of us. I had this experience of having a very interesting repetitive loop in my cycle with tznius, where like every 1 to 2 years, I'd be like, oh, I need to start over. I need to take everything to the seamstress. I need to improve my mitzvah of tznius. And every single time I felt inspired or spiritually connected, or I wanted to grow in my Yiddishkeit, I was always turning my attention to my clothing. And my husband actually was the one who lovingly called me out on it and said, you are a Jewish person and your relationship to God is holistic and has so many pieces to it, and obsessing, tripping over the exact same detail over and over and over again, which for me was my collarbone, over and over and over again, is not necessarily being motivated by that deep spiritual internal space that you think it is. Why is this constantly what you are reaching for when you feel connected and feel inspired? And so for me personally, who deeply values tznius and yet sees how a hyperfixation on it can actually really flatten a woman's Judaism and can become our sole source of spiritual energy and can be done in a way that isn't balanced or integrated. And for me, it was a distraction and was just something that I could constantly go to because it was kind of like this quick thing that would also make me feel better in society, which is like I'm living up to the highest level of expectation around tznius. So I think there's like a lot of deeper things there around our external expressions of tznius. And it can be really helpful and healing to go to the root of what tznius is and to work on the parts that nobody can see. And yes, of course, halacha, even external halachos are also between us and God. But sometimes when you grow up in a halachic system that translates into a social community and communal norm, sometimes those things can become very interwoven in a way that becomes tricky for you. So going back to the source and the root and the quiet spaces and the walking with Hashem can be so helpful in this area. In Miriam Kosman's essay, which was in the Hashkafic portion of the book, she speaks about sitting in a taxi cab and hearing a public radio show where an estranged father and daughter were reunited live on the radio. The radio host calls the father and says, "Hi, I have your daughter on the line. You haven't spoken to her in 10 years and she's here to be reunited with you." And you hear this like awkward, stumbling kind of reconciliation happening in front of all of these listeners. And she writes sarcastically, like, how kind of the father and daughter to live estranged and with so much pain for so many years, just so that the listeners of this radio show could have a high on their commute to work. And it really hit me how when something is shared publicly that clearly should be happening in private, an estranged father and daughter may be able to share the reflections afterwards publicly in that more intentional way, not straight from the inner world in order to benefit others. Actually hearing them be reunited on set is very jarring and uncomfortable for us because we have that natural sense and intuition of this should be happening in private. And I think part of this is not just about what exactly we share and how many details we share, but is also about speaking with subtlety and nuance, honoring the dignity of our own self-expressions, that when we do share, we don't feel the need to over-explain ourselves or overshare to ensure that whatever is being expressed from our inner world is being directly transposed into the other person's inner world, because that is a lack of boundaries and a lack of self-dignity in our own self-expression, which is saying, I'm going to share as much as I feel comfortable sharing with the clearest and most defined language that I can, and there is going to be subtlety here and nuance here, and there is not the full picture, and I'm not going to over-explain myself, because sometimes we over-explain or we overshare in the hopes that the inner world will be explained perfectly, clearly, that if we give all the details, they will understand where we're coming from. But that actually isn't a dignified way of sharing, where I share what I'm comfortable with the boundaries that are in place for me, trusting that the other person can receive whatever they need to based on what is respectful to my own inner world to share. If tznius is about living in a way that honors the sanctity of the inner world, then by definition, it doesn't impose itself on another person. It leaves a space for the other one there in the conversation, for the one receiving it. It shares of its own inner world in a way that isn't an imposition on anyone else. There's space for the other one there, and there's space for Hashem in that conversation. Now I want to talk about the depth of clothing and the depth of the self-expression that we experience through clothing. And I am someone who cares about personal style and recognizing the deep personal expression that we could be reflecting to the world in the way that we dress. And I do intentionally get dressed in the morning. Obviously, sometimes I'm busy or distracted or a lot else going on, but I try to structure my closet in a way where it's more possible for me to do that on a daily basis, because I enjoy showing up in the world in a way that feels aligned in a physical sense too. But I do just personally see clothing as an opportunity to express ourselves and to be who we are in an external way. Obviously not in a way that completely defines us, but in a way that might be a taste or a touch or connection to the spirit that we want to bring to the world. In Dr. Dina Rabinovich's essay, she writes about speaking about clothing so that our clothing can be imbued with the depth of tznius, as opposed to having them define tznius, which I thought was such a mic drop moment. Can our clothing be imbued with the depth of tznius, as opposed to the clothing itself defining tznius? Because as we so clearly see, tznius is not defined by clothing, but tznius does extend also to our clothing, and we want to imbue our self-expression of the way that we dress with the sensitivities and the nuances and the subtleties of tznius. In her essay, she speaks about how after Adam and Chava ate from the tree of knowledge, they suddenly became embarrassed of their nakedness and searched for clothing. And Reb Samson Raphael Hirsch says that this wasn't a punishment, but was simply a reflection of a new stage of the world, where in the Garden of Eden, their bodies were clear channels for their soul, which is why they had absolutely no shame about their bodies, because bodies are holy. But in this world of distortion, where a body could be distorted and could be seen and stripped and seen as something separate from the soul, they would need to cover their bodies as a reminder that they were walking this delicate balance of constantly needing to remember that the body is a channel for the soul inside of it. And yes, the body in and of itself is holy when it is synthesized and mirrored and an expression of the soul in this world. So it's truly just a distinction for us and a reminder that we live in a world where there is a balancing act. When we do interact with someone, we constantly need to have these boundaries that allow us to express our souls through the channel of our bodies. And I think this also makes the point, by the way, for dressing in a dignified, beautiful way as being part of tznius, because if you dress in a way that is not dignified or not respectful or not hygienic, that can also distract from your essence being expressed in this world. So there really is this balancing act when it comes to how we really express tznius in the clothing, in the way that we communicate ourselves to the world, to showcase that this body is a channel for the soul, and that I treat it in a dignified and respectful way. And I recognize its holiness as being a partner in my soul's connection to this world and to you, to this person I'm interacting with. And that is a huge piece of how we choose to express ourselves in the world. The description of the special clothing of the Kohen is the most detailed description of clothing that we find in Tanakh. The clothing of the Kohen is holy and a reflection of the holy acts that they are doing. So too in our own lives, our clothing can be acts of self-expression and of dignity and of beauty, and reflections of these sacred and beautiful ways that we live our lives connected to our souls. So beautiful clothing and clothing that honors our self-expression does not in any way need to be seen as a distraction from our souls, but can rather just be like a celebration of our souls and the holy act of our souls, just like the Kohanim wore beautiful garb to carry out their holy work in the temple. The foreword of this book was written by Rabbi Yitzchak Berkovitz, who Rabbi Anthony Manning studied under, and where he says he first learned about this really novel and holistic approach to tznius that he had never heard before. He writes that educating the masses in sensitivities is much more complicated than codifying rules, and kind of bemoans the fact that we've seen a real shift and trend towards lists and lists of rules around tznius, as opposed to a real emphasis on educating people in sensitivities when it comes to cultivating an appreciation and a respect and a connection to this mitzvah? Can we relate it in a way that is about communicating the depth and the subtlety and the nuance as opposed to imposing really strict rules? And Rabbi Manning speaks about how too many detailed rules around the subtle and sensitive areas on tznius can actually really disconnect from people from their own intuition. One of the examples that's given is about how men and women interact in an Orthodox society. And we live in a time where men and women do often if you are working in a workplace, there's going to be interactions. There are sometimes these rules that are put into place that are kind of like extensions of halacha or sensitivities, trying to impose these sensitivities on a person, which are really admirable. We really are just trying to protect the sensitivity of the mitzvah. But unfortunately, what it could do is it could strip someone of that own felt sense of, is this tznius? Does it feel like a comfortable boundary? Does this feel purely professional? Is this becoming a little bit emotional? Are we connecting in a way that's like truly feels tznius? And that's not something that someone else can dictate for you, and not something that you can follow all the rules and still show up in a way that is not necessarily tznius. So really, it's about cultivating an inner sense of tznius within our own selves and within our own homes, and really truly like walking lifnei Hashem, walking before God, so that when we are in these situations that do require more nuance and subtlety and sensitivity, we kind of have this felt sense in our bodies of what it means to be a tzniut and what it means to be a tznius person. And as a society, can we trust people to cultivate that internally and to give them the resources to cultivate that themselves, so that they can show up in any circumstance with that center and that internal self that is truly walking lifnei Hashem and does not need to be dictated or told what to do, but knows how to walk before Hashem. There's so much more that I didn't get to cover in this book, but I do want to say that there are halachos in Shulchan Aruch that do speak about the laws of dress, but a lot of the details that we experience in our communities actually fall under the camp of Das Yehudis, which really depends on your hashkafa, your environment, where you live, what the norm is of the halachically minded women in that community. And that's how people are able to create and cultivate an environment that is truly tznius and follows a more holistic and balanced way of experiencing tznius in our lives. As I'm wrapping up this episode, I'm thinking there are 300 more things from this book that I didn't get to touch on and that I wish that I could have. There was so much in here that was truly such a shift to me in the way that I see this principle of tznius in its deeper application and what it truly means to walk before Hashem, and also in its practical expression in my life in halacha, and how to navigate the external expression within my clothing, within the way that I show up in the world, in a way that feels balanced and holistic and integrated, and an expression of where I am inside, as opposed to an external imposition or something that is like from the outside in, clothing first, and then hopefully eventually seeping in inside, but truly being something that is clearly a reflection of the sanctity of my inner world, of my own space, and how that is reflected, that I walk before Hashem, and that when I meet you, I want to communicate that my essence is primary and that I want to connect to you on that level, while still honoring the fact that my body is a sacred portal for my soul in this world, and that there's beauty in our self-expression through our clothing, that our clothing can be holy, beautiful acts of expression in this world, and that we don't have to have such a rigid, regimented view on tznius in order for us to live in a truly tzniut environment where we really honor our souls as primary, and where we see that in others, and we are really able to look past the way others look to access their essence internally. And obviously we show up with agency in the world, and we get to choose how to reflect that, but we also go through so much in our lives. And I know that sometimes we don't get to reflect our essence to the world. And I've definitely been in that space time and time again, whether that be not being able to reflect the way that I want to feel in my clothing style-wise or tznius-wise, either because of overwhelm or going through something in our lives or struggling in so many areas that a person can be, where it's not necessarily being reflected externally to the world. So if you are in a space where for so many reasons you're having trouble reflecting that externally, instead of becoming fixated on the external piece of it, go inward, internally, to the midah of tznius, to the Torah principle of tznius, to what it truly means to walk before Hashem. Instead of trying to control your externalities so much, soften a little bit, go inward to that inner space, and then see how that will naturally, slowly radiate into the way that you walk in the world externally. Just a reflection of that pneumius, of that internal space, of the sanctity of your inner world, and of your essence that you reflect externally. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week.
אלוקיי זכני נא בתורתך ובמצוותיך לחבר את נשמתי תמיד אליך, לחבר